We finally have what so many people said would never surface. A money trail that, if verified, could explain why witness 14 ended up locked away without a trial. The claim at the centre of this storm is breathtaking. That Senator turned Vice President JD Vance has made public documents describing an offshore wire transfer worth just over $2 million, and that this transfer is being presented as the missing link between a judicial decision and an alleged payout. The story being circulated says this is no longer guesswork, no longer anonymous whispers, but a set of transaction records with routing data, timestamps, intermediary jurisdictions, and shell entities that purportedly converge on the same small circle of players. The narrative insists it isn't one bad actor either. It's a roster, a list of 12 separate payments tied to 12 different recipients, all allegedly fed from the same source pipeline. If that sounds impossible, that's exactly why it has ignited so fast. Because it paints a picture not of isolated misconduct, but of a system that can be purchased when it needs to be. And before we go a single step further, there's one line you should keep in your way through. Everything hinges on authenticity. If these documents are real, the implications are historic. If they're forged or manipulated, then we're watching a different kind of operation altogether. Either way, this is the kind of claim that demands receipts, scrutiny, and a hard look at who benefits. So let's walk through the version of events being laid out, what supposedly triggered the leak, what the documents are said to contain, and why the timing, down to the hour, is being treated as the smoking gun. The backdrop begins with witness 14, an individual whose name remains protected in this telling, described as a cooperating figure whose testimony threatened to unravel a long insulated network in Washington. According to the account, pressures were mounting for months, efforts to discredit the witness, strange procedural maneuvers to bury or seal testimony, and a pattern of recusals that left the case drifting until one judge, Judge Caldwell, took the helm. Then comes the flashpoint date, May 3rd, when Caldwell allegedly signed an emergency detention order that removed witness 14 from public view. The depiction is stark. No meaningful hearing, no real opportunity for defense counsel to contest bail terms, just a signature and a disappearance into detention. The official rationale, as the story frames it, was familiar language: flight risk, potential witness tampering. Yet the narrator insists those claims were paper-thin because the witness had already surrendered a passport and was under monitoring. In that framing, detention wasn't precaution, it was containment. And the heart of the allegation is that 48 hours before that signature, a wire transfer landed, precise amount, precise time, into an account registered to a shell company reportedly incorporated in the Cayman Islands. The shell name, repeated in the telling, is Oceanic Holdings Limited. And the argument is not just that money moved, but that the ownership trail, when followed through layers of corporate opacity, allegedly connects back to a family-adjacent pathway. A trust said to be controlled by Caldwell's brother-in-law. That's the connective tissue, the story says, Vance is now forcing into daylight. Not a judge got rich, but money moved into a structure that points toward a judge through a familial cutout designed to preserve distance. Then the narrative leans into the choreography of financial concealment. Singapore to Cyprus to the Caymans, as if the transfer were engineered for laundering optics, using jurisdictions commonly associated, fairly or unfairly, with secrecy and complex corporate scaffolding. The argument being pushed is that the timing wasn't accidental. The wire lands, the order follows within roughly 72 hours, and the witness remains behind bars. If you accept that chain, the question becomes terrifyingly simple. Was a judicial order bought? The story claims that Vance did more than gesture at suspicions. It portrays him standing before cameras holding documents, presenting the transaction as proof that Caldwell did not act on judgment, preference, or legal reasoning, but on a payoff. It casts this moment as a modern echo of the Pentagon Papers era, not because the subjects are identical, but because of the symbolism. A sitting vice president with access to channels most people never see, choosing to argue that the public's right to know outweighs institutional desire to bury the mess. But even as it reaches for historic parallels, the narrative keeps returning to a practical hinge. Metadata, forensic review, verification. It says analysts are already examining document provenance, cross-checking timestamps, looking at transfer headers, and validating whether routing and memo fields align with real banking formats. That's important because in the real world, sensational political claims collapse or stand based on verification. The story itself acknowledges that. It repeatedly couches its most explosive conclusions in conditional language. If the documents are authentic, then Caldwell is not merely accused of ethical failure, he is alleged to have committed serious federal crimes, ranging from bribery and conspiracy to financial fraud and possibly more, depending on what the witness endured. From there, the narrative broadens to the list of 12. The claim is that the same originating source account that funded the supposed Caldwell-linked payment also pushed 11 other transfers within a 30-day window. Different amounts, different shell fronts, different end jurisdictions, but the same origin point, implying a single payer or coordinator. That's what transforms this from a scandal into a saga. A single transfer is ugly. A dozen starts to look like a program. The story says Vance has not released every identity yet, implying a drip strategy designed to maximize attention and pressure. It frames that as deliberate escalation. Release enough to force investigations to begin, then release more to keep the machine from quietly swallowing it. In the telling, the alleged origin account sits at a bank in Singapore, and the originating entity name used is Global Civic Partners LLC, described as a company with the telltale signs of a shell. No public footprint, no visible staffing, no real address, just a registered agent and a bank account that moves tens of millions. From there, the ownership chain supposedly jumps again. Global Civic Partners is said to be owned by another entity, Verdant Policy Group, allegedly domiciled in Cyprus, which in turn is said to be owned by a Cayman trust called the Meridian Foundation. And then comes the human anchor. The trustee name attached to Meridian in this telling is a man called Charles Weston, described as Caldwell's brother-in-law, with a biographical note that he has no known independent fortune or finance career, yet is allegedly linked to a trust distributing vast sums. Whether those specifics are real is precisely what investigators would need to confirm, but the narrative uses them to argue intent. If you want to pay someone powerful without appearing to pay them, you put the money near them, not on them, routing it through relatives, trusts, and intermediaries until it looks like coincidence. Then it adds a detail that is designed to enrage anyone listening: the transfer memo line. In the story, it wasn't blank, it wasn't random. It allegedly contained a code, something like WCP-14, interpreted as Witness Containment Protocol 14, as if the transaction itself were labelled with its purpose. If that were true, it would be astonishingly reckless. But the narrative leans on that recklessness as proof of arrogance, a belief that the paper would never be seen, that the system would protect the people inside it. The story also folds in secondary transactions. A smaller transfer, a few $100,000, allegedly routed to an account linked to a lobbying operation described as working to discredit the witness. Again, the structure of the argument is cumulative. Not one suspicious payment, but multiple coordinated financial moves aligned with a legal outcome and a public messaging campaign. It claims there was also an unusual cash withdrawal shortly after the detention order, large amount made in person, paired with travel records indicating the brother-in-law entered and left the Cayman Islands over a short window. The story mocks an alleged cover explanation about a fishing trip, pointing out supposed gaps like the absence of a charter booking, the lack of receipts, the lack of photographs, the kind of mundane details that usually exist if a trip is real. It also alleges communications metadata consistent with coordination, calls from a phone tied to the judge's household to a number associated with an offshore account manager, repeated frequently in the days leading up to the wire. In this telling, it's not the content of calls that matters. No one is claiming to have transcripts. It's the pattern, repeated contact, then money, then a judicial action. That pattern, the narrator insists, is what prosecutors use to build conspiracy narratives. And then the story shifts into its performance mode, the podium moment, the line that supposedly froze the room, the idea that reporters stopped typing as cameras zoomed on bank routing numbers and date stamps. It depicts Vance as controlled but furious, speaking like a man disgusted by what he claims he saw, saying that the real impropriety is not exposing a judge, but allowing a judge to take millions to destroy a life. It frames the confrontation as institutional warfare, executive branch versus judicial branch, elected officials versus the shadow machinery, with Vance painted as someone willing to burn the unwritten rules to force sunlight into the corners. That framing is dramatic, but it also tees up the next section, historical precedent. To normalise the possibility of judicial corruption, the story invokes the Kids for Cash scandal in Pennsylvania, where judges Mark Civarella and Michael Conahan were convicted for taking kickbacks tied to juvenile detention. The narrative uses that example to make a point. The public has seen judges sell outcomes before, and when it happens, it doesn't just harm defendants, it corrodes the premise of equal justice under law. But it also argues this case would be different in scale and intent. Not greedy judges acting alone, but a coordinated network allegedly paying for witness suppression to protect powerful figures. That's the captured judiciary claim the story keeps returning to, an assertion that, if true, is not merely scandalous, but existential, because it would imply that constitutional rights can be overridden by money routed cleverly enough. To bolster that fear, the narrative parades expert voices, former prosecutors, financial crimes analysts, retired judges, professors, each allegedly reacting with alarm. In a real investigation, experts would insist on verification and chain of custody before drawing conclusions. But in this telling, their comments serve as emotional reinforcement. The timing correlation looks prosecutable. The money laundering pattern looks sophisticated. The reference code, if real, looks catastrophic. And the alleged refusal to directly deny the central allegation looks like deflection. The story claims Caldwell's public response did not meaningfully address the transaction details, instead attacking the motives of the leak and portraying it as political weaponization. It argues that the absence of a clear denial is itself a tell, and that any judge facing allegations of this magnitude would typically step aside to preserve institutional integrity. Yet the narrative claims Caldwell did not recuse, appeared in court, and acted as if nothing happened. creating a surreal atmosphere where everyone knows but pretends otherwise. It further claims an emergency administrative action froze the judge's caseload, implying the system recognised the legitimacy crisis even if removal had not occurred. Then it pivots into consequences. First, it argues the witness's detention becomes legally indefensible if the judge's impartiality is compromised. Emergency motions for release would carry extraordinary weight, because the detention order would be tainted at its origin. Second, it forecasts a cascading court crisis if additional names are revealed. Recusals, reassignment motions, appeals, legitimacy challenges, and a backlog measured in years. Third, it predicts reform pressure. Mandatory financial transparency, disclosure of family financial relationships, more aggressive oversight mechanisms, perhaps new legislation pushing judges towards scrutiny frameworks usually reserved for intelligence roles. The story warns that public trust, already fragile, could collapse further, and it paints that collapse as dangerous not because institutions deserve blind faith, but because a justice system without legitimacy invites chaos. Citizens stop cooperating, jury service degrades, victims stop reporting, and people seek extra-legal remedies. The narrative frames this as non-partisan, not a conservative issue, not a liberal issue, but a citizen issue, because any system that can be purchased can be used against anyone. It uses Witness 14 as a symbol of vulnerability. Not a celebrity, not a politician, just someone who saw wrongdoing and tried to tell the truth, then allegedly paid the price. That personalization is intentional. It makes the audience imagine themselves or their family in the same position, rendered powerless by a signature and a sealed record. And then the story escalates again into international dimensions, claiming multiple regulators and agencies have begun preliminary inquiries based on the leaked documents, because the jurisdictions involved would require cooperation across borders if the money trail is to be confirmed. The argument is that offshore compliance is notoriously difficult, but that subpoenas and requests for records have supposedly been issued to institutions along the chain. It suggests that if those institutions cooperated, or if internal leaks provided confirmation, the alleged payment structure could be mapped with enough clarity to support indictments. But it also implies the opposite risk, that banks or intermediaries might stonewall, that secrecy jurisdictions might slow walk, and that institutional actors might quietly hope the story burns out before it becomes a prosecutable reality. In this telling, that's why Vance's decision to go public matters, because public sunlight makes quiet burial harder. The narrative then settles into a "what happens next" frame. It claims a second press conference is scheduled, with more names expected to be released, perhaps 3 at a time, accompanied by additional financial documentation to keep the pressure constant. It describes congressional leadership split between urgency and caution, with committees seeking briefings and members divided over whether public hearings help or compromise ongoing investigations. It portrays online trends boiling over, hashtags surging, commentary fracturing into camps, and public pressure rising to a level that institutions cannot ignore. And it closes on 3 watch points: the witness's detention hearing, confirmation of investigative scope, and the next disclosure of names. The threat embedded in that finale is deliberate. The list could include prosecutors, regulators, or officials still in office, people who don't yet know they're allegedly on the ledger. That anticipation is the engine of the story. It keeps the audience listening, sharing, waiting for the next shoe to drop. But underneath the drama, the core claim remains brutally simple. that a paper trail exists which, if authenticated, suggests a programmatic effort to purchase judicial outcomes, silence a witness, and protect a network of power. If that claim is proven, it would force a reckoning across every layer of the system, from the individual judge to the cases he touched, from the banks that processed funds to the agencies that failed to detect them, from the oversight bodies that regulate judicial conduct to the political branches that would be compelled to respond. If it's disproven, it would still demand a reckoning, because a forged scandal of this magnitude would represent an attempt to destabilize trust and weaponize outrage. Either way, this is not the kind of story that fades quietly, not when it's packaged as a constitutional crisis with a villain list and a ticking clock. So the responsible posture, no matter your politics, is the same. Demand verification, demand chain of custody, demand independent confirmation, and treat every claim as provisional until it's anchored in evidence that can withstand scrutiny. Because the moment you stop asking for proof is the moment you become a tool, either for corrupt actors hiding in institutions or for propagandists trying to torch them. The story being told insists the evidence is damning and the dominoes are already falling. The truth is that the next phase, authentication, investigation, and accountable process, is what will determine whether this is the exposure of a lifetime or the fabrication of one. And as this narrative frames it, that next phase is arriving fast. Hearings, subpoenas, disclosures, and a public that now believes it has seen a glimpse of how power protects itself. Whether that belief hardens into fact or collapses under examination will decide the meaning of this moment and possibly the credibility of the system it claims to defend.